I'm going to record to the cloud. We're recording.
Okay.
Welcome, Eric, to the Daily Dose. You are our first interview for this series. We're going to be interviewing an expert every single day, and you are the first expert in the lineup, so thank you for doing this.
Well, I am thrilled and honored. Thank you for the invitation.
It's really cool to kind of be learning this new equipment and everything with you. Since you're a professional radio host, I thought you might be a good person to put my trust into first. So we're talking about PSTD. Oh, I didn't even say that right. PTSD.
PTSD.
You know, it probably works. And the pandemic and what we've been going through since mid-March in 2020 is just unbelievable. And it sounds like you have something new and fresh to talk to us about related to that. So tell us what the Mental Health Association has been talking about regarding the pandemic.
Well, one of the things that we're really worried about, especially depending on how you look at it, whether you think we're, coming to the tail end of it or whether this is just a dip between two mountains, whatever you may be thinking about, it doesn't change the fact that over the last 2.5, 3 months, people have been going through a very difficult time. And so what we're concerned with is if people have not been addressing their mental health needs over the last, let's say, 3 months, they may be experiencing some trauma that has been left unresolved. That unresolved trauma can appear weeks, months, even years down the road as post-traumatic stress disorder. And a lot of people are like, well, I wasn't in an airplane crash. I didn't go through a hurricane. This is not trauma. But it really is. Trauma is just kind of an unresolved mental situation that you didn't know how to cope with. It doesn't matter how massive it may have been, or it doesn't matter if it happened over the span of 10 minutes or 10 weeks. Trauma is just unresolved mental health concerns. And if you don't cope with those now, then what we're afraid we're going to see, like I said, months or years down the road, is this rash of PTSD from people who thought they could, quote unquote, power through it right now and just deal with it and move on. But if they didn't know how to deal with it, it's going to appear down the road as PTSD. And we're kind of trying to figure out how to handle those situations and talk to employers about what they may be seeing in their employees as they come back to work in that regard.
Well, boy, that's very understandable. And some people might think, well, we're all going through it. The whole world is going through it. Everybody in our state, everybody in our country is going through it. But everyone is experiencing their own personal challenges. Everyone is different, handles things differently, and it's impacting people in many different ways. And I feel like I'm going off in a bunny trail, but I'm just going to say it. I think that one of the worst things I can think about is people that have had loved ones in a hospital setting or rehab setting or senior living setting that they couldn't get to. And at a time when they would want to be with their loved one more than ever and be an advocate for their loved one and spend time together, being separated like that or having them pass away, and maybe even worse, questioning the circumstances because they weren't there.
Right. Yeah, that to me, and fortunately I haven't had that situation for me personally, but the thought of potentially losing someone during this time, not being able to visit them as they were passing away, not being able to get any kind of closure, not being able to have a service, not being able to see, the body or anything like that, not being able to have any of that kind of closure. I can't even imagine what people could go through who are in those situations. And we know there's a lot of people out there like that, and my heart just bleeds for them.
Absolutely. And people that are going through their own surgeries and hospitalizations and recoveries without having someone next to them.
Yeah.
And that could vary from state to state or hospital to hospital. But I think for the most part, a lot of people have been through that. My father-in-law was hospitalized yesterday, and my husband and his mother had to wait in the parking lot for a long time. They've handled it really well. And the hospital did allow my sister-in-law to come in and spend some time with my father-in-law yesterday. And they called him in during the middle of the night, and they did let 3 of them come in because they thought that he would pass, but he did stabilize. So, I mean, it's a tenuous situation, but it's impacting families greatly. And I'm seeing a lot on Facebook where people are really upset about what's happened with their parents, and people who had surgeries delayed because they were not essential. And
Right.
you just wonder how people are being impacted by these surgeries being put off that were quite necessary and probably essential, except it just didn't fall into the right rule book.
Yeah. And Catherine, you touched on a really interesting point. I don't even know if you meant to, but I wanted to chase it a little bit because you mentioned people could say, well, we're all going through the same thing. Why am I worried about this? And maybe my neighbor isn't, or something along those lines. I use this analogy a lot because one of the divisions that we have here at MHA is an entire division dedicated to children's mental health. And so I talk about that a lot because, let's be honest, who can't get behind taking care of kids? I mean, So one of the things we talk about is paying attention to children's mental health. And the reason I bring this up is because, yes, you and your neighbor might be going through the same trauma during this pandemic, but you and a child who lives in the household with you might be going through the same divorce. You might be equipped to handle the situation you find yourself in. Maybe you have a mean coworker who's bullying you, and they have a mean kid at school who's bullying them. As an adult, you might have the coping mechanisms to deal with what you're going through. To a 5-year-old, what's going on in that same household is their entire world. They're 5. They don't have the tools. They're not equipped. So yeah, you and your neighbors might be going through the same trauma during the pandemic, but they might have been through something like this before and you haven't. Or maybe they have a different life experience that has helped prepare them for this and you haven't. So two people going through the exact same thing, if one of you has the tools, if one of you has coping mechanisms, or maybe even just has a better support system and you don't have those things, then you're at a greater risk of PTSD than your neighbor. So say, well, we're all going through the same thing. If I'm fine or they're fine, why am I not? Yeah, you're going through the same thing, but you're handling it in different ways because of your life experiences, because of the things you've been through, because of the support base you have, whatever it might be. So you can't really argue we're all going through the same thing, so it's not an issue. It is an issue because you're going to handle it differently.
Yeah. And really it is different for everybody because I'm living in a household with 2 adult children and my husband, and to some extent we've had a good time cooking up a storm, walking around our little backyard pond together, and I mean, we've done fine. And then we have friends that were totally isolated during this whole time without living with anyone, and there's other people that are living with people that they don't get along so great. So
yeah.
And
that's a whole different kind of trauma.
yeah. And I'm oftentimes a fly by my seat kind of gal. I don't get too rattled about things. But for people that we all need in our lives that are so organized and detailed and they plan out everything, this has been just totally turned their world upside down, and trying to work from home or not working. I mean, it is crazy. And I think that's so great that you guys already see this coming and are preparing to help people.
Yeah, we have to be. We're always trying, that's one of the reasons why as an organization, we have 35 different programs here at MHA. And a lot of the reason that we do is we're constantly trying to think about what are the needs going to be for now, or what's going on now in the city of Wichita, but where are the gaps in services? This organization provides this and that organization provides that, but what about the people who fall in between? If we see those gaps, or if we see those potential needs that might be coming up, we're always trying to find a way to put another program in there to address those. And so this is what we do. We look in the environment and say what might be coming up, where is a need going to be, and we're trying to plug that gap to ensure that people who need mental health care are never left to fend for themselves.
And how is this funded? It just sounds like you're so large and you're doing so many things and have so much to offer. How is it funded?
Well, it's nearly entirely grants. The 35 programs, I don't have an exact number, but the vast majority are funded by grants. We have a few what I call retail programs, in so much as our counseling center out at Harry and Webb. People will pay for a lot of those services, although not all, even some of those are grant funded. And then we are actually the largest nonprofit provider of housing in the state of Kansas. And one or two aspects of those housing situations are also funded kind of retail. You can literally walk in off the street, sign a lease, get an apartment. But most of the housing and a lot of the counseling center even are grant funded. So my predecessor actually in my office still works here. When I was hired, she was moved over to become the director of grants, and all she does all day, every day is track and administer and oversee and everything else with all these grants. So that's a large portion of our about $10 million annual operating budget.
Wow.
Yeah.
So are you already doing outreach for people that are traumatized by the pandemic? And now we have the riots going on, and even in Wichita we had violence and, you know, big police tactics to try to quell that last night.
Yeah.
And I don't even think the news is out about that, but I know it's really impacting the neighborhood that I'm aware of.
Sure. Yeah, we you know, during this entire time, we've had a lot of our staff who are already community-based staff. They you know, they might come to the office a couple hours a week and that's it, because they're out in the community. The pandemic did not change that. We got them hand sanitizer, we got them masks, we paid them hazard pay, and they remained on the streets this entire time, seeking out people, especially the homeless, you know, hugely at risk, not having a stable environment to stay. And so those community-based staff continued to be community-based staff even during this pandemic. And certainly we've also tried to continue to raise awareness of the counseling center for all the reasons that we talked about. People need to be aware of their mental health. People need to be thinking about what's next. People need to know that there are resources to address issues. And we really push this idea that we always have for a long time, but continued to push during this time, which is kind of your annual mental health checkup. You know, we have the annual physicals. Everyone does the annual physical, but why do it for our body, but not for our brain? So if we're going to do an annual mental health checkup, no better time than right now, because people who might think, oh, I'm perfectly fine, oh, I don't need to go in and talk to somebody. Well, you might think that, but I also might think that my fever will go down in an hour. My wife, who's a pediatric nurse practitioner, assured me, no, your fever is not going to go down in an hour, Eric. And she's always right. And one of these days I'm going to learn that. Why not have someone who actually knows what they're talking about answer those kinds of questions? If we go in for a checkup and in fact we are fine as we thought we were, then great. We have a qualified stamp on how we feel. But if we think we're fine and we go in and find out that we're not, wouldn't you rather know that and have the opportunity to address that now, rather than 6 months down the road discovering you have PTSD because you left your mental health issues unaddressed during the pandemic?
And your life can really unravel if you are stuck in a spiral of depression, and you're not motivated. So let's speak on that a little bit about untreated depression and untreated trauma. What kind of ways that can impact just everything else in their life?
Well, one of the main things with PTSD that we see is that people, we always remember our trauma, and there's nothing wrong with remembering trauma. It's how we deal with it. But you can't remember it without reliving it. That's when you know it's more of a PTSD kind of thing. If you're constantly reliving it, if the same emotions you felt at the time are continuing to come back, if you can't sleep, or so if you see dramatic changes in sleep patterns or eating patterns, if you are having nightmares a lot, all those kinds of things point to unresolved trauma.
And we hear and see so many people on social media and in daily conversations talking about how strange their dreams have been during the shutdowns.
Absolutely.
And how their sleep patterns have been interrupted. I went through that many years ago. I couldn't sleep, and I just got over it. I can hardly even remember it. And boy, I sleep great. And I can't imagine how hard that would be for people. I just think that has got to be the worst.
Yeah, it's rough, and like I say, I didn't come from a mental health background, so these are all things that I've learned over the last few years. But I think back, I moved to Kansas at the end of 2010. So I had obviously changed jobs because I came here from out of state. So I changed jobs, moved to a new state. I just finalized my divorce back in Chicago. So I had three of the most significant stressors a human being can face all going on concurrently. And I can tell you that probably for the first roughly 18 months of living in Kansas, I barely slept at all. In hindsight, that really should have been a clue to me that I should talk to someone. But I do what probably 60% of the world does, or really technically more than that, which is no, I'm fine, quote unquote, man up, forgive the phrase, but I'll power up, I'll sleep through it. I tried sleeping pills, I tried everything. In hindsight, I really should have talked to someone, but I just thought maybe tomorrow I'll sleep okay. Maybe tomorrow I'll sleep okay. And that's unfortunately not a great coping mechanism, but it is a lot better than the number of people who say, I'll be fine. I just had a rough day. I'm going to come home. I'm going to have a couple beers. I'll get a good night's sleep. That cycle that we can fall into, speaking of mental health issues that feed on themselves, that I'll have a couple beers and I'll be fine. That's where you get into what we call a co-occurring disorder, which is where you have a mental health issue. Now it's coupled with a substance abuse issue. And those two things feed on each other. We see so many co-occurring disorders because this phrase we use anecdotally, all of us do as a society, is self-medicating. Taking alcohol, taking drugs is not self-medicating. You're feeding a mental health issue with another mental health issue, and you're making both of them worse. And we don't know, a few months from now, how substance abuse is going to factor into this whole equation, but you got to figure it's going to be in there somehow.
Well, that's going to be another upcoming interview, I think, for next Thursday. Yeah, so we'll be talking about that. But even with seniors, people will self-medicate with alcohol during the day, and then too, just the impact on your health, and that's going to impact your sleep, and it just turns into a vicious cycle.
It does. And seniors face, I mentioned we have an entire division dedicated to children's mental health. We have another division dedicated entirely to senior mental health, because that's already a difficult and fraught enough period in your life without factoring in substance abuse, without factoring in inability to see your loved ones. My parents moved to Wichita just a few months ago. I've seen them maybe a few times. I'll pull up to their driveway. They'll step out on their front porch. We'll talk from 20 feet away, because that's what we can do. When they moved here, they're like, all of my kids are here. All of my grandkids are here. Going to see family all the time. That has not worked out. And they are only seniors in this city who have run into that situation.
Right. Well, and what we're finding is that seniors are making a decision after being isolated like this to prepare to sell their home and move to where the family is. So just like your family moved here, a lot of people are thinking about selling and moving away. So my husband and I are real estate agents, and just like you were talking about, sometimes real estate comes at the same time lots of those other stressors are happening.
Sure.
And so that's something that we've always been a part of. And going through a real estate transaction is challenging enough, but then you factor in a divorce and a pandemic, or all these different things.
Right.
So I appreciate you taking time to talk through some of this with us.
Oh, my pleasure.
I'm curious about the mental health assessment that you mentioned. How do people go about scheduling that? How is that paid for? And then give me a three-parter. My concern is, will they worry about that being on their record? Will that be part of their medical record? Will they be ineligible for something or judged in some way because they had a mental health assessment? Because I bet that would be one of the big factors with regard to not going.
That's interesting. That's actually a really fantastic question, and yet it's a question I've never gotten before, or even frankly really thought about before. So let me tackle the third part of that first, because it's so interesting. No, for starters, it's mental health, yes, but it's still health. If you wouldn't worry about your doctor talking about your cancer to anyone because it's a medical record, same thing with us. Our consumers are protected by all the same HIPAA laws that apply to someone who went in for a heart attack or a stroke. There's absolutely no any kind of publicly available record. It is part of your health records, of course. But there's no kind of ramifications. There's no public knowledge of that. You are the only one who knows. The only time that, I personally have run into something like that is because I personally deal with a type of depression. It's very cyclical. Luckily, it only tends to rear its ugly head every several years. But for instance, if I'm filing for new health insurance through a new employer, let's say, and they're asking all these questions about your health history, there's a box there for depression. I have checked it. I have not checked it. It kind of probably depends on my mood at the time. I don't know. But the same way you would decide for yourself, and you probably should, I suppose, if you're being asked for health insurance purposes, do you have a family history of heart attack? You're probably going to check that box. And yes, if you have a history of depression, you should check that box as well. Other than that type of self-disclosing, there's no kind of publicly available health record, rather any more on the mental side than there is on the physical side. So hopefully some things to rest.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that a little bit deeper too, because gun owners, as an example, are concerned about their family physician asking them as part of a checkup, do you own firearms? And they feel that that's very intrusive. And I would imagine that they might be concerned about mental health checkups impacting their right to have firearms.
It's interesting you say that, because it brings up an entirely sidebar, which we may or may not be able to get into today. And if we can't, that's fine. From a practical standpoint, people who have mental health issues are actually 12 times more likely to be the victim of a crime than they are to be the perpetrator of a crime. So this correlation, to your point, that is drawn by society at large between violent crime and mental health is completely backwards of what it should be. That said, I do realize, practically speaking, that perception, that erroneous perception does exist. Not being a gun owner myself, I don't necessarily know the answer to that, but it's a valid point. And I would just say, again, for just members of society at large who are listening to this, any perceptions they may have about violent crime or guns and the correlation to mental health, it's a minuscule, it's practically immeasurable, the correlation between those two. And yet you see politicians and you see the media spouting off oftentimes following a violent crime about mental health and blaming it on that. And that's completely reversed from what it should be. But that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah. It's like many things, it's just completely upside down of what reality is. And that could be a whole nother topic. And where I was going with that is not being concerned about them being a danger to themselves or others, but them not being able to qualify to be a firearm owner. I think that might be the concern.
Like I say, I'm not familiar with the process, but unless whoever oversees that type of thing has access in some way through some federal law, I suppose it would have to be able to see your health records, which I can't imagine is the case. But unless it were the case, I don't see any way that a mental health checkup would appear or cause any sort of a threat to gun ownership.
And on the mental health checkup, how do they pay for it, and what is that experience like?
Sure. So one of the things that MHA did about maybe 2.5 years ago is we instituted what's called same day, next day service. So most of us, whether you're going to a mental health practitioner or a specialist for whatever your physical health issue is, you're used to the prospect of you have to go to your general practitioner, and then they have to make a referral, and you have to call the specialist to make an appointment, and blah, blah, blah. And for a long time, it was the same thing for the mental health world. We instituted something called same day, next day service, where you don't need a referral from a general practitioner. You don't need to call and wait 2 months for an appointment. You can literally walk in off the street, our center at Harry and Webb, walk up to the reception desk at our storefront and say, I'd like to speak to someone. And 20 minutes later, after filling out some paperwork, they might be in a therapist's office. It's literally that simple. Because mental health is not something you want to wait on. If you're not feeling right, if you're worried you might harm yourself, whatever it might be, you ought to be able to get service to address that issue. And so that same day, next day service allows people, like I said, literally walking off the street, and 20 minutes later, they're talking to a therapist. So making the appointment, I mean, obviously you can still call and make an appointment, but in our case, you don't have to. The appointment is not needed, assuming you can. In fact, we relocated some of our facilities because 2 of our counseling centers didn't have a large enough lobby that if more than 4 people walked in off the street at a given time, they didn't have a chair to sit in. So we actually consolidated all of our counseling centers out to that Harry and Webb location simply because it happened to have a very large lobby. In fact, we've since remodeled it so it has an even larger lobby to accommodate people who do walk in off the street. No appointment needed. As far as paying for it, initial assessments are provided at no cost. We just want to make sure everyone's doing well. If additional counseling after that is necessary and a recurring cycle of appointments are set up, that is a retail program. Although we do have, coming from higher ed, what I refer to as a scholarship program, where we have a certain number of donors who really want to make sure everyone has access. And so they put money in this fund. If someone walks in and can't afford the recurring appointments, we're able to draw from that donor fund to pay for the counseling that someone walking in off the street needs. The other thing that we have as well is a program whereby if you need more specialized services, for instance, what is it called? Dialectical behavior therapy or play therapy, or some of these programs at the counseling center which are a little more specialized, those programs might be provided by a grant. Or for instance, if you're, let's say, a veteran, maybe a homeless veteran, or maybe someone who just hasn't investigated it, you might be eligible for payment for your services through the VA, but you may not be aware of it. We actually have staff whose job it is to work with those people and try to find benefits they might be eligible for, even if the consumer's not aware of them. So we'll talk to you. Are you a veteran? Did you used to work for the post office? Whatever it might be, and see if they can find some latent federal benefit that is available to pay for the appointment that the consumer themselves did not know about.
Very good. Do you have a special program for realtors? Probably not. That might be popular. I don't know.
Friends are realtors.
The fundraising that you do, I know you are working on, is it the Beautiful Mind Gala?
Gala, yes.
Okay. Yeah. And that's planned for October. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's currently planned for October 3rd. We had it last year at Mark Arts. It was a phenomenal success. We had something like 60 of the biggest companies in Wichita come forward to be corporate sponsors. And I think a lot of that is because companies are starting to realize that mental health, because it affects such a huge percentage of society in any given year, they're realizing this affects my employees, this affects my customers, this affects my vendors and my suppliers. And companies are realizing they can't just sit back and say, well, it doesn't affect me, because it's 25% of the workforce is being affected in a given year. Those are people in the business office who are transposing decimal places. Those are people on the manufacturing line who are forgetting to put rivets in the airplanes. These are people who are sitting at their office and it looks like they're working because they're sitting at the computer and they're answering their phone. But last night, their wife asked for a divorce. So they're going to sit there for days or weeks on end, too afraid to say, I need mental health care, so I'm taking the day off. So they're going to sit there and have zero productivity because their mind, all they can think about is, I'm going through a divorce. It's called presenteeism. So there are for a lot of reasons that these companies are coming forward, but so many of them did last year, and we expect that to be the case again this year, who really want to support the programs because they know it directly affects the health of the city in which they operate.
Mm-hmm.
So we're thrilled to do that. A large percentage of the income that we have, not through the grants and not through the retail programs, but what we call non-grant expenses. Expenses that come about as a result of a particular program that are not covered by the grant that funds that program. So a big percentage of those ancillary funds come because of the gala, and we're just thrilled to have the level of corporate support that we do.
It's amazing. It's so commendable that they do that. And I know that the employers provide a lot of services that I hear about within kind of the senior networking world.
Sure.
For example, education and support, helping senior parents, because just the same statistic, like 1 in 4 employees might be dealing with aging parents and all of the issues related to that. And that can really impact productivity. So it's great
absolutely.
that they do that. So what else are you talking about within the association about PTSD?
Well, yeah, the main thing is, like I say, just trying to raise awareness, and again, because of such a strong level of corporate support that we have, reminding employers that this is going to be an issue, or is more than likely to be an issue, because what we don't want is for people to go back to work finally when they're able to again. As you see, I'm in my office, and I was absolutely giddy last week when I was finally able to come back into the office. I was giggling like a schoolgirl because I was so happy to be back. But a lot of other employees are also returning, and they're thinking, okay, fine, this is great. Everything's returning to normal. I'm back in my office. Things are going to be like they were before. And employers might be thinking that as well. But what we don't want is for those employers to find 6 months or 2 years down the road that they're dealing with this rash of PTSD. To the extent that corporate America here in Wichita supports us, we want to give those employers a realistic picture of what could happen. And we want employers to be understanding of that, I guess I'll say, is the best way. I've talked to some companies who say, well, Eric, we have an EAP, we have an employee assistance program. We really don't need MHA services. I will tell you that about 2 years ago, there was a study done in, I believe it was in Minnesota somewhere, and they surveyed people who missed a day of work because they were getting mental health care. And a majority of those people who missed a day of work would rather lie to their boss and say that they missed a day of work because they were arrested and spent the night in jail than just be honest and say, I missed a day of work because I needed to get treatment for a mental health issue. If employees are not willing to be honest, are so worried about the stigma of mental health that they'd rather say they got arrested and spent the night in jail than just admit it, then clearly the stigma of mental health is still a substantial issue. So we are really strongly pushing employers, corporations, businesses in this community to be aware of that, and to be understanding and to realize if they missed a day of work, there's probably a good reason for that. You need, as a supervisor, you need as human resources personnel to be cognizant of that concern and be more sensitive to those kinds of things. Because if I'm an employee and I miss a day of work and I'm just going to lie to you about where I was, then that's not a very positive mental health environment for an employee to be in.
Right. And people joke a lot about, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, being in a bad mental health environment coupled with potential PTSD, that's the worst possible combination.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, a lot of people joke about taking a day off for mental health day.
Yeah, it's a punchline, right? And it shouldn't be.
Yeah. What I noticed during the Great Recession is that realtors around the country and mortgage lenders around the country, and I'm sure this was the same in other industries as well, just retreated to the sofa and watched TV all day, or went to bed and just pulled the covers up over them, because when times are tough, sometimes they can be too hard to really face.
Sure.
And it doesn't help anything to, it's one thing to give yourself some patience and grace and realize that you need to have rest and have those moments. But it's another thing when it drags on for days, weeks, months, and upends your life financially, and just identifying with who you really are, because you're not being productive and not feeling yourself. Like
Yeah. Yeah, hiding under the covers is unfortunately a solution that a lot of people use for a lot of things, and doesn't tend to help. I speak a lot. I probably speak about 24 times to various companies or civic organizations or churches or whatever it is here in the city. One of the things I always say is, we have this tendency to sweep things under the rug, and I'm like, I don't know what we keep under the rug, but it always seems to come out eventually, and when it does, it's bigger, it's faster, it's stronger. And if we had just gotten the help we need when we needed it, rather than thinking that sweeping it under the rug was going to help, we'd be much healthier society.
Well, and people can numb out on alcohol or prescriptions or whatever, but they can also numb out on Netflix.
Right.
I'm all for a good binge watching, but if you've literally finished Netflix, that might be a problem. So,
Very true. Very true.
Yeah. So you have 2 radio shows also. Tell us about your radio shows. You have Mental Health Minute, and is that running currently?
It is. The station, I think, has been, I don't know if new shows have been recorded because you actually have to go into the studio. So I think that's been on hiatus, but I think they've been rerunning shows until we can get back on. In fact, I have a meeting tomorrow just to make sure that we're back on track to start those up fresh again. But yeah, Mental Health Minute, the great thing about it is because we have so many programs, we have about 200 people on staff, each with their own interesting perspective on the program that they work in. We've got 200 shows basically built in. So we come in and we talk. And honestly, again, because I don't come from a mental health standpoint, I can sit down with any one of our 200 people on staff and spend an hour having that conversation with them about the program and what they do and how they came to it, et cetera, et cetera. I invariably come away learning so much more about what the organization I work for already does. And I'd be like, man, I should have known this 3 years ago, but thank goodness I interviewed you.
Yeah.
So it's really informative, not just for me, but I hope and I'm sure for the people listening in as well. So
Very
yeah,
good.
I came to that show because of the financial advice column, the Ask Eric, which is basically a radio version of a column that I've been doing in the newspaper for several years now. I got great questions about money or investing or debt or whatever it is. And I had 300 words to answer them. And some I could answer in 50 words, but others I could have dedicated 3 entire columns to. And so it's nice to have the radio version of that to really delve deeply into people's financial questions and answer those on the air as well.
How many shows a year do you produce for that program?
Both of those are weekly. I do one of those, of each of those shows every single week.
Oh, so like, are you doing like 50 some a week or?
In a year, yeah, 52
Yeah, a year, yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Wow, that is incredible.
It's a busy schedule, but I like it that way.
Well, you are doing good work out there. So thank you for your voice and for introducing people to these topics and helping them delve deeper. So anyway, and thanks again for being on today. And if people would like to reach you or the Mental Health Association, how can they do that?
So we have a few phone numbers that I will give out. Obviously, our website is kind of a one-stop shop. It's mhask.org. It stands for Mental Health Association of South Central Kansas, hence the SCK. .org. And so there's a lot of info on that. Our general number here in Wichita is just 316. I'm sorry, I'm going to screw this up because I hardly ever give this one out. 316-685-1821. That's really our administrative offices, although some of the non-retail programs are based in this building at Central and Woodlawn as well. For counseling purposes, which I think is probably how a vast majority of people kind of enter MHA in general, that number is 651-1241. And then certainly for any companies out there who are listening who may be interested in being involved in the gala at all, they can call me directly at 620-755-2583. So it's Great. And of course, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, all those kinds of things as well.
Okay, very good. Well, Eric, thank you so much. I'm going to stop recording.
Okay.
And we might have you on again. And certainly I'd love to have you on the television show when we
I would love.
come off this break. So,
Yeah.
all right. Thank you so much, Eric.
Thanks, Catherine. I appreciate it.
And thank you for watching the Daily Dose with Empowering Seniors. I'm Katherine Ambrose.